Not content with hacking the phones of the families of murder victims, News International also put under surveillance the lawyers seeking redress for those invasions of privacy. The two solicitors responsible for most of the cases against the disgraced media organisation, as well as their relatives, were secretly filmed and followed by private detectives. The ambition? To discredit them.
They requested that I do this work, so I was never going to stop doing the work. The only stop came when the News of the World closed.
We'll hear from one of those in the private detective's crosshairs. And we reveal how News International attempted to shield the Prime Minister's then spin doctor from any negative fallout. Walk right in, sit right down, how a government which said it'd be tough on immigration found itself letting any Tom, Dick or Harry into the country. Who killed off the political career of the latest Papandreou to lead Greece? A member of his cabinet might know the answer. And since the days of exorcism and bedlam, we've been failing to cure mental illness. Is medical science on the cusp of offering serious new hope?
We are really facing a tipping point here in where we are with the research on mental illness.
If it wasn't true, it'd take some believing, but it is true, and News International admit it's true. The News of the World hired a private detective to investigate lawyers representing people who'd been hacked by the News of the World. This was not something that happened ages ago, but very recently, and its implications reach into Downing Street. Richard Watson has the story.
It must have seemed the most ordinary of days for the residents of this house in North Manchester last year, but unknown to them, they were the target of covert surveillance. They were followed and filmed by a private detective from a nearby car. Every move was scrutinised, yet they had no idea. A quick stop at Tesco's, then back home, all captured on film. They were trailed every step of the way.
It's absolutely terrifying to think that somebody can be watching you, following you around, doing your everyday things, and you haven't got a clue that they're there. And if it happened then, it could be happening now. I'm very scared and nervous now when I go out of the house and looking around, seeing if anybody's there.
The woman filmed was the former wife of Mark Lewis, a Manchester-based solicitor who was leading the way in suing News of the World and its publishers for hacking phones. Mark Lewis, on the right, with papers in his hand, was becoming a serious threat to Rupert Murdoch's media empire. In 2008, 2 years before the surveillance on his family, News Group paid one of his clients more than £500,000 in an out-of-court settlement. This massive payout looked like hush money to stop the wider story of phone hacking from coming out. Newsnight has learned the identity of the private investigator who trailed Mark Lewis's family in Manchester. His name is Derek Webb, a former policeman with 15 years of surveillance under his belt. He ran a company called Silent Shadow, and early last year he was asked by News of the World to trail Mark Lewis and another solicitor, Charlotte Harris, who used to be his assistant. Charlotte Harris was also targeted for surveillance. She was developing her own portfolio of phone hacking clients. News of the World believed she was having an affair.
And they named the other party. They wanted me to go to his address first, the first night. I went to his address. It was clear that he wasn't living there, so they then told me the two addresses, which were solicitors' firms. They basically gave me the opportunity of which one I wanted to do, but to do both of them to try and see where they'd meet up.
We don't know who authorised this specific surveillance operation against Mark Lewis's family, but this dossier of documents obtained by Newsnight shows that on other occasions, the idea of using surveillance against the two solicitors was carefully discussed. In essence, what these documents show is that the idea of using private detectives to dig around into their personal lives was discussed at a very high level. But why? These documents were passed by News Group to the Metropolitan Police as part of their investigation into phone hacking. In turn, they released them to Mark Lewis late last week. Many are emails from News Group's solicitors Farrer & Co. On the 26th of March 2010, Julian Pike, a partner with Farrer, wrote, "We should also pursue the line of whether Lewis and Harris are an item. I had a brief word with Ian E., a reference to Ian Edmondson, then a senior journalist on News of the World, and he was sure they were, but we need to put some surveillance onto them.
Well, on two levels, I'm devastated. In terms of my children, to follow my teenage daughter, my youngest daughter, and video her is nothing short of sick.
The documents show that News Group newspapers suspected that the solicitors were in a relationship and were passing confidential information to each other to help with new phone hacking cases, and they were looking for evidence. Farrer & Co. commissioned a firm of private detectives called Tetrix to look into their backgrounds. On the 6th of May last year, Julian Pike from Farrer's wrote to the firm, "I write to confirm my instructions. If we can show Lewis and Harris living together, we think this may assist us in bringing professional misconduct proceedings against Lewis and/or Harris." The firm of private detectives did not carry out surveillance work as far as we know, but they did write a report seen by Newsnight which provided a lot of detail about the personal lives of Charlotte Harris and Mark Lewis. There's no evidence that Farrer's commissioned any surveillance on the solicitors, but we do know that News of the World did. So was it appropriate to place two solicitors under surveillance? Many say this tactic was indefensible. And News International seemed to agree. They told us tonight it was clearly deeply inappropriate in these circumstances. This action was not condoned by any current executive at the company. News Group's lawyers, Farrer & Co., did not instruct Derek Webb to carry out any surveillance, but we wanted to ask them about the email which shows they had been considering the use of surveillance. The firm said tonight they can't comment on these matters without their client's permission, which they do not have. There's one final wrinkle to this story, and it involves the Prime Minister's former press spokesman Andy Coulson, who resigned as editor of News of the World over phone hacking. Another document we've seen shows that even after he'd left, his former employers, led of course by the Murdoch family, were very sensitive about damaging his work with David Cameron around the election time. At a meeting called to discuss phone hacking 6 days after the election, News Group's lawyer at Farrer's stated he had been instructed not to do anything for 3 or 4 weeks to prevent further leaks around the election because of the inevitable attack on Andy Coulson. Although The Guardian has switched its support to the Liberal Democrats, they will probably still have a go at Coulson. The key interest is to keep Lewis/Harris out of these cases to reduce the negative publicity. It seems even after he'd left News International, Rupert Murdoch's former editor was still receiving protection from his old company.
Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Tom Watson MP, a member of the committee investigating the scandal, and to Mark Lewis, the lawyer whose family was under surveillance. Mark Lewis, were you aware that you were under surveillance?
I wasn't aware of the fact, and it wouldn't have occurred to me. I didn't think anyone would ever stoop that low.
Were you aware your family was?
That's even worse. It never occurred to me. I have my job in my office, I'm in the court, etc. My family are well out of it, and quite rightly are out of it.
So what does it feel like to know that you were being spied on?
It's horrific, but it was more horrific that it was my family, my children, my daughters were being infiltrated, that people were watching them, taking pictures of them. It shouldn't happen. It just shouldn't happen.
Now, Tom Watson, how significant is this discovery?
I think it's very significant. You know, back in when we took evidence from James Murdoch, he said the true picture of phone hacking began to emerge in September 2010. And now we see the company response to that was to hire private investigators to try and besmirch the reputation of the lawyers who were representing the victims.
So the timing is significant, quite apart from the events themselves.
I think it shows an utterly relentless and ruthless organisation, clearly highly politicised, who would stop at nothing to try and cover this case up. And it's yet another revelation that I think will shock people when they get to know what it means.
And what of the remarks that indicate that there was concern about any reflection upon Andy Coulson, David Cameron's spin doctor?
Well, I think for the political world, that's clearly the most significant part of this. It shows that the company were highly politicised. They were trying to close this case down, but they were also desperate to protect their man at the heart of government. And this was at the time of the coalition talks. Andy Coulson was destined for a great and powerful job at the heart of government, and he got there.
How unusual is it, Mark, for solicitors to employ or be involved or have knowledge of the workings of private detectives?
Well, there's a different matter between playing the ball and playing the man. You might be investigating and have reason to investigate things that are happening amongst the clients, that if it was proper to make inquiries, then you would do that. But to investigate the other side's lawyer, I've never come across that ever before.
Never come across
Never come across that. And you shouldn't do that. Lawyers should not be investigating other lawyers.
Why not?
It's fundamental to the principle of law. For being a lawyer, we're meant to be able to represent our client without fear nor favour. But people are actually trying to cause you to have fear. People shouldn't be looking at my home address. People shouldn't be following my wife, following my former wife, following my children. People shouldn't be looking at me to see what I did in my private life. Nothing about my private life could possibly have affected anything that I was doing at work.
Well, you're familiar with what they were suggesting. We can't go into the details of it, but you're aware of what they're suggesting.
Yeah, I'm aware, but even if you take everything that they were trying to suggest, even if they'd have been able to prove anything, it made not one jot of difference to the whole case or anything. They couldn't. It wouldn't make any difference. The only thing that they could do with that was to try and use it to some sort of advantage, to either intimidate me personally or to stop me representing my client properly. They were playing the man.
Now, James Murdoch's due to be appearing before your committee again, isn't it, on Thursday? This change what you're going to ask him?
Well, I think he's definitely going to have to explain why, when he said that the company would get into the bottom of the story, their response was to hire private investigators to follow lawyers around. In fact, I'm pretty certain he'll want to answer that before the committee. He's got some very serious questions to answer, because his original testimony has not just been contradicted by the former editor of the News of the World, but it's been contradicted by Tom Crone, the in-house lawyer. And I'm sure we'll want to go into great detail about how his recollection of events differs to a number of other people who work for him.
This whole affair is getting murkier and murkier, isn't it?
If I'm being honest with you, I just think this organisation is rotten to the core and it needs dealing with. And this revelation tonight, shocking though it is another example of how we've not got to the facts even now.
But look, they themselves acknowledge this was deeply inappropriate behaviour. They have shut down the News of the World. They say they have changed. They have.
I heard Rupert Murdoch tell shareholders at their AGM in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago that they would leave no stone unturned. What we now know he meant by that was we would hire private investigators to make sure that we snooped on the private lives of the lawyers representing the victims, including Millie Dowler's family's lawyer. I don't think the shareholders interpreted his words as meaning that, and like all these things, these stories have been dragged out of the company week by week rather than giving us the facts of the whole case.
To be fair to him, he said that after these events.
Well, one would imagine that given his personal interest in uncovering the truth, he would now know that this event had taken place, and at his AGM 2 weeks ago he would have been in full knowledge that private investigators had been hired to snoop on solicitors. He either chose not to tell his shareholders or he didn't ask the right questions to get to the facts, and either way I think he's got some explaining to do.
And where do you think this leaves things?
Well, I think there's all sorts of interesting aspects in the timing. For example, they say no current executives were involved in it, but the newspaper had the reports. He was holding on to them a long time after former executives had left, and they chose to do nothing.
Thank you both very much. And tomorrow, Richard Watson has some extraordinary revelations on surveillance ordered by the News of the World over many years. Now, if you were a criminal, terrorist or illegal immigrant intent on getting into Britain, this summer was the time.